I grew up about 2 hours north of here, just outside of Ann Arbor. And my mom still lives up there. My dad passed away, but my mom still lives up there. And I was going to go visit her, but she's in Arizona, visiting my family. My daughter is now 16 and had a big dance recital, and she wanted Grandma to come see the dance recital. So my daughter goes to this school that has a huge, high school, that has a huge dance program, a public school that has a huge dance program. We live in an area that used to have a very large Mormon population, and there's a lot of dance, I think, involved in some of whatever they did. I'm not Mormon. And so anyway, there's a huge dance program there, and it's really cool that these kids are just, and all these, it was really interesting because there are a lot of girls, a lot of gals involved. But this time when I went to the dance thing, there were 4 big guys dancing. And I thought, those were the smart ones. I mean, they have their arms around all these girls all the time. It's like guys who play clarinet, you know, you're surrounded with them. Okay, you got some handouts there. Is the warm-up coming around now? Yeah. Okay. When I started teaching, how many of you are music ed majors? Okay, well I was. And I was a junior high band director. And that was my very first job. And so, in Jackson, Michigan, across junior high school. So I remember standing up in front of my band the very first day. And you guys, you will never know what white knuckle terror is until you're in front of your junior high band and nobody else is around the very first day, and you look at this sea of faces all looking up at you and you think, why didn't I become an accountant? And so you're looking down. Well, anyway, what happened was I realized that the University of Michigan, where I got all 3 of my degrees, really didn't, I hate to say this, prepare me for what I really needed to be as a music educator. And so a lot of the things that I realized I didn't know what to do was, number one, I really didn't know how to warm up a kid. I didn't know how to warm up myself. I had no idea what to do. And so one day, I was yelling at a kid about not practicing or something, and the kid said to me, Mr. Spring, the hardest part about practicing is opening the case. And so all of a sudden it dawned on me that my students had no idea what to do. I mean, they would open the case and they'd look at these parts and they'd think, what's next? So the first thing I started thinking about was for my whole band, of giving them a way to practice. Well then, after a short period of time being a public school teacher, I became a college band director. And I was a college band director for 7 years at a little school in Sioux City, Iowa, Morningside College, where, for those of you who want college jobs, my first job, I taught clarinet, saxophone, bassoon, marching band, concert band, and music ed courses. And so I realized when I was directing my concert band that my brass players were really good. My woodwind players were okay, except for the clarinets, who were terrible. And I couldn't figure out what was the deal. Well, I had this wonderful colleague there, a guy named Randy Kohlberg, who teaches trombone at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro now. And Randy was this incredible mentor to me, the kind of person, you know, that will take you out to lunch and tell you you're making an absolute idiot of yourself, and you actually can accept that. Well, one day he said to me, he's from South Texas, and he said, Mom, I think you're the most inconsistent player and teacher I've ever met. And I was really kind of angry. And I said, well, Randy, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you got a good reed and your fingers are okay, you sound great. But if your reed's not so good and your fingers aren't so good, you sound terrible, and so do your students. So I started thinking about it, and I realized I did absolutely nothing on a daily basis to ensure that my playing and my students' playing was accurate. So I started trying to think about what's important. So we went to lunch, we go to lunch every day, he and I. And we went to lunch the next day, and after I cooled down a little bit, I said, Randy, I need to ask you about what you talked about yesterday. And he said, well, I was hoping you would. And I said, what do you think students need to know to be better clarinet players? Or what do I need to know to be a better clarinet player? And he said, well, first you have to work on your sound, because you don't sound too good sometimes. So I started thinking, well, what do we do? So I called my teacher, who's now retired from the University of Michigan, a man named John Moeller, who's still alive. He was an amazing, amazing teacher for me, and what he said for all of us was just amazing stuff. I said, Dr. Moeller, what should we be doing? And he said, well, you should have been doing what I've been telling you to do all along, and that's to start with long tones every day. I said, oops. And so then I started to think, well, what else should we be doing? And the other thing was, I thought we needed to be doing some scales, and we need to work on finger motion, we need to work on our articulation. And by doing the sound thing, we're talking about the airstream, by working with the fingers, we're obviously working on finger motions. And then I found this great book around the same time. And if any of you are interested, I'll send it to you, you can send it out. It's called Mind, Muscle, and Music. And it's by a man named Frank Wilson. And it was published by the Summer Bandwagon years ago. Summer Bandwagon doesn't exist anymore, I don't believe. But it was a really great publication. This book is like, you know, Windows for Dummies and all that kind of stuff. And this is like how your brain works for dummies. And it was great in explaining how certain things work. And how does it work when you're practicing? Why does practicing work? And what should you be doing and all this? So he talks about a part of your brain back here called the cerebellum. And these are, I guess, in real simple terms. And his whole thing was that as you're working and playing the clarinet or doing anything like this, it takes a lot of motions. We're actually doing more motions than our brains actually can allow us to do in any one given moment. How many things can you do a second? Do any of you know? 20. And that's why movies work. Because once you get beyond 20 things a second, you don't see individual frames, but you see motion. And so when you're standing up and playing, a piece like this one that I just did, you're almost at 20 things a second. If you're playing, let's see, I figured this out once. Well, if you're playing the end of Weber, which one is the one that goes, is that one or two? Two. So you're playing that, let's say you're playing it at 120. You're doing 12 notes a second. And for a lot of us, that's really pushing it right there. So that's 12 notes a second right there, 12 things a second, 12 notes. And now that doesn't take into consideration the breathing. That doesn't take into consideration one of the hardest things that we do, and that's this. I mean, how many times have you tried to balance something on 2 sticks or whatever? You know, I mean, it doesn't work. So, I mean, the whole idea of what we're doing with our brains to keep this, I mean, as a father, you remember watching your kids stand up and try to learn to walk, and they stand up and hold themselves like this on the coffee table or whatever, and then they let go, and there we go, and they go down. Thank goodness they have fat butts. But they, and so, so you're verging on, at the end of the Weber, the Polacca, you're verging on probably close to 16 or 17 things a second. Well, then you've got the little lady in the front row who decides she's going to cough, so she wants a piece of candy, and she thinks it's going to go a lot quieter. She goes, you know, for like 20 minutes, and your brain is focusing on that. So, when we're practicing, what we're doing is we're taking patterns and we're memorizing patterns. But the patterns go into this part of our brain called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is instead of being able to shoot out individual motions, it shoots out groups of motions, what he calls ballistic motions. And so once they've started, they shoot out this burst of motion, and once it starts, it can't be stopped. And so what we're doing when we're practicing is training ballistic motions in our brain. And so by going slower or fast and increasing tempos and repeating things over and over again, what we're doing is we're training that part of our brain to shoot out a group of motions as opposed to individual motions. Now, there are a number of ways that you can test your cerebellum if you'd like to test your cerebellum. One is the next time you're in a performance that doesn't really matter, or say you just really learned a lick, you've learned one that you've really learned something, and it's really a hard lick, and you hear a clarinetist in the next practice room, you go knock on the door and say, hey, come listen to me play this. And you sit down and all of a sudden you start thinking about it, and you start, you know, fumbling all over the place. What happens is the cerebellum has shut down, and you've gone back to the part of your brain that controls the individual motions, and you can't do it. It goes too fast. The other way to test your cerebellum is to take everything out of your hands and start going down a flight of stairs and start thinking about what you're doing. And you'll stumble, because it's just like too much going on. So the cerebellum is a very important part. So actually, if anybody has a travel driver, jump driver, whatever, I'll give you somebody a copy of it off my computer, and you can, and you can just pass it around. But it's so John said, well, scales and thirds are good, but but he didn't really know why they were